Hey everybody, mel0n here. Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be finishing up our full review of the Keychron M2. Now I'm not going to be covering the accessories or the unboxing experience as I did cover that in my unboxing video, so if you did miss that you can go ahead and watch that. But today we're going to be taking a much deeper dive into the M2 itself, how this mouse performs, what its ideal use cases are, some of its flaws, and some of the things that it does very well. And since that this is Keychron's first shot at a true ergo shape, there's a lot of interesting things to talk about today. Now before we get into it, just a couple housekeeping things. Keychron did provide me a small discount on this unit in order to get it into the country just because shipping costs are so expensive. This review is not sponsored or endorsed by them, they were just kind enough to give me a small discount on it. As always, as you've seen with my previous reviews, regardless whether this unit is a review sample or I receive a discount on it, I'm always going to be unbiased. And as always, I will have timestamps down in the video description and the comments, and this video will be fully subtitled as well for y'all. Since Keychron mice are primarily used for work and office kind of hybridized use case, I'm going to be reviewing this as a work mouse, not a gaming mouse. I will talk about gaming performance as I always do with all of my reviews, but since this mouse is designed to be a work mouse, I'm going to be treating it as such. If there is a future version of the M2 that does have more gaming focused performance like 4K polling rate, I will re-review the unit as a gaming mouse, but for this review today we're going to be looking at this as an office work mouse. Alrighty, that's all for the housekeeping stuff. Let's go ahead and start off this review by talking about the M2 shell, which is the most unique part of this mouse. Alrighty, now as I mentioned before, this is Keychron's first true or true-ish ergo mouse. We have seen Keychron in the past say that their mice are ergonomically inspired, but as we've seen on the previous M3 series mice, they were all just symmetrical mouse. Yes, they do have a very heavy hourglass shape, but they are in no way or means an ergo mouse of any kind. However, that all changes with the M2 here because this is the most ergo or ergo-ish mouse that Keychron has released, and their marketing is actually accurate for this shell shape. Now, the shape of the Keychron M2 shell does share a lot of similarities with the Vaxi mel0n and the Vaxi Outset AX. However, it's a lot bulkier. Kind of think of like a Death Adder V2 bulkiness instead of a slimmer down shell like we've commonly seen on more recent ergo mice. Now, one of the first things you'll notice right off the top is that the front of this mouse looks like a symmetrical mouse, whereas the back of this mouse looks more like an ergo mouse. So again, very similar to the Vaxi mel0n. However, unlike the mel0n, the M2 has very flat sides, which is a little odd for an ergo mouse. It's not something that you commonly see. The entire left side of the mouse is almost completely flat. It does have an ever so slight small indentation towards the center of the mouse, while the right side of the mouse does have this large exaggerated ergo flare out towards the rear of it, very similar to the Vaxi mice I just mentioned. One other really unique thing about the left side of the M2 is that, as you can see here, once you go past this ergonomic flare out towards the side of the mouse, it actually narrows out towards the front of the mouse. Now, one thing you actually notice here is that the narrowing is actually kind of under the actual shell itself. So the whole shell actually kind of twists a little bit. So the top of the clicks actually hangs over where the bottom is supposed to be. Now, this kind of gives a very unique kind of anchoring spot for your hand here. It feels very reminiscent of what Razer tried to do when they added the extra ring finger support onto the Death Adder V3 wired edition. Obviously, this is executed a little differently than it was on the Death Adder V3 here on the M2, but it does add a lot of support for your pinky and ring fingers when you're doing claw grip styles. It just adds a very natural resting point that feels very, very comfortable for your hands. Now, earlier I described the Keychron M2 as being an ergo-ish mouse, and that is kind of the same naming convention I also applied to the original Vaxi mel0n, where it was one of those things where it was kind of a hybridized mouse of a sim and an ergo, which just has this kind of ergo hybrid design. However, when the mel0n released, that leaned much more into the symmetrical side of the shape, whereas the Keychron M2 has leaned much more heavily into the ergonomic side of the shell design. Now, while I'm classifying the M2 and the mel0n as an ergo symmetrical hybrid, there are a lot of ways that Keychron has designed the M2 to avoid a lot of the pitfalls that happened on the mel0n, and I wanted to talk about those in a little more detail because these hybridized sim ergo shells do have a lot of potential and can be very comfortable. However, they have to be executed in a way where they're compatible for a lot of grip styles, not just one grip style like we saw with the mel0n. Now, the first notable change when it comes to the M2 is that the M2 is available in two different sizes. There is a medium version, which is 121 millimeters by 66 millimeters by 40 millimeters. Then there's also a mini version, which is 117 millimeters by 64 millimeters by 38 millimeters. Now, today we're going to be talking about the medium version of the M2. If you guys want to see me cover the mini version of the M2, let me know down in the comments, because I went for the medium version because I have bigger hands. But if you want to see me talk about the mini one, I can make a review about that that in the future, just let me know down in the comments. Now, one other area where the M2 differs itself from the MP01S is in terms of the hump design. On the Vaxi MP01S, the overall hump of the shell did position itself slightly towards the back of the mouse, but the actual hump itself was a very just gradual slope. There was no sharp peak to it, whereas the hump on the M2 feels like kind of a hybridization of the X2H and the Vaxi Outset AX, because it has the height of the X2H's hump, but it's positioned more similarly to the hump positioning on the Vaxi Outset AX. This makes the M2 Medium's overall shell feel a lot more compatible for grip styles that rely on contact at the base of your palm or centralized palm. Yet another area where Keychron has done a fantastic job with the overall design of the M2 is in the sides. Now, I did mention them earlier because the left side of the mouse is pretty much completely flat aside from a small indentation towards the middle of the mouse, where the right side has a very Vaxi-esque style ergonomic flare towards the rear. Now, one thing that's really great about the left side of the shell, the M2, is that because it's so tall, it does give ample space for people with bigger hands to have a comfortable place to rest their thumb without preventing actuation on the main clicks or accidentally actuating these side buttons. There's a lot of free real estate on the side of the mouse for you to get a very comfortable grip, which is a great thing to see. Another great benefit of the sides being almost completely flat is that it does give you a lot more customizability and where your thumb is going to rest, instead of being railroaded into kind of putting your thumb wherever the kind of curve is in the side like we've seen on other mice. This one does give you a lot more freedom of where you want to position your hands, which is nice to see. It's a very small thing, but it does give you a lot more ability to customize your grip, and it makes the M2 a lot more compatible with a variety of grip styles. Now, on the right side of the mouse, we have this very Vaxi-esque ergonomic flare out towards the base of the mouse. Now, comparing the feel of the M2 against the Outset AX and the MP01S with my 7.5 inch by 5 inch hands using a claw grip, the actual ergonomic feel of this flare out feels almost one for one. The ergonomic flare gives a ton of support for your hyperthenar, so it's very comfortable for your hand to rest against this ergonomic flare and make a lot of surface contact. The contact from my hands is a little more towards the middle of the hypothenar, where the MP1OS and the Outset AX was more towards the base. However, for me, this is still a very comfortable grip style, and because the right side of the mouse is pretty much completely flat, there's a lot more compatibility, so I can shift my entire grip up a little bit more to match the feeling of the M2 in my hand, which is a great thing. Now, overall, in my opinion, this is probably the best like ergo symmetrical hybrid shape I've used. I really like the feeling of the M2. It fits my hand like an absolute glove, which is very rare because, again, I have 7.5 by 5 inch hands, so it's pretty hard for me to find a mouse that fits my hand really well, which is why I generally lean towards bigger ergo mice. But despite the M2 being a smaller ergo symmetrical hybrid, it still feels incredibly good for my hand size, and since there is two sizing options, there's the bigger medium version and there's also the smaller version, this is going to be very compatible for a lot of grip styles. With the added height on the sides of the mouse as well, it's going to be very easy to fingertip this mouse as well. Across the board, this is just a really good execution of a symmetrical ergo hybrid, probably the best I've personally used so far. The only thing I would potentially change about the M2 shell is that I would love to see Keychron make a pure ergo, not a ergo symmetrical hybrid. If they just added a little bit of height onto the left side of this mouse, raised it up and added a tilt, this would be probably one of the best budget ergo mice you can get on the market, and I really think Keychron should looking into making this a pure ergo. But for this being Keychron's first shot at an ergo-ish mouse or an ergo symmetrical hybrid, they've absolutely knocked it out of the park, so props to Keychron. They've done a fantastic job here. Now, I'm going to talk about the actual feel of using this mouse and how it performs for daily tasks and some gaming performance in a little bit, but first I want to talk about one common pitfall that has plagued all of the Keychron mice that unfortunately the M2 has fallen into, and that is the coating. Alrighty, now the Keychron M2 is using the same non-coated ABS plastic we have seen on all the previous Keychron mice. I've already talked about Keychron's ABS plastic at length in videos before this one, and I don't really want to beat a dead horse again here with the M2, but Keychron has made a small change with the M2 where they have actually removed the integrated grips that were found on the previous M3 series mice. Now, personally speaking, I'm actually a really big fan of this. The grips did help the overall gripability of the mouse, not having to rely on just the ABS plastic definitely helped a little bit, but the grips were still sorely lacking. You always had to use some form of a third-party grip tape pretty much no matter what. So I'm happy to see those removed here on the M2. But again, just like all the other previous Keychron mice, you will run into issues with this mouse feeling slippery over long-term use. For an office mouse or a work mouse, which is what the M2 is designed to be, this is completely fine. However, on a more gaming-focused version of a Keychron mouse like the Keychron M3 Mini 4K, which has the exact same coating, I would expect Keychron to include some kind of grip tape or a better coating in the future. Again, for a work use mouse, it's fine, but in the future, it will be nice to see Keychron use a better better coating on these mice instead of just the flat ABS plastic, not only on the gaming versions of their mice, but also on the work versions of their mice as well. Alrighty, so the weight of the Keychron M2 is advertised as weighing in at around 53 grams. However, in traditional Keychron style we've seen with their previous M3 series mice, they generally tend to weigh in 1 to 3 grams heavier than they're actually advertised. So as such, the M2 medium is weighing in more around the 55 gram range, while the M2 mini is probably going to be within the 53 gram range instead of the advertised 50 gram range. Despite the inaccuracies of the weight advertisements, I still think the weight is completely fine. 50 to 60 grams is, in my opinion, the ideal weight range for this kind of mouse, so it feels completely fine. You can add on a fast set of skates like the X-ray pad Jade dots, which is what I've done to my M2, and it feels even lighter. So the weight isn't a problem in my eyes, but a problem I would like to see resolved is Keychron maybe shape up these estimated weight numbers a little bit more on their website, because this is probably the 7th Keychron mice that they've released that has an inaccurate weight number. It would be nice to see their advertisement weight be a little more accurate going forward. Now, another area where Keychron has done a fantastic job on the M2 is the overall QC of the unit. Now, there is some side flexing on the unit, but you have to put an insane amount of pressure on that to even feel it move remotely. There is a slight bit of creaking towards the back of the unit, but that was because one of my base screws was loose a little bit, so once I tightened that up, I had no problems. But overall, the mouse actually feels very, very, very solid. You won't experience any flexing or creaking during normal use, and overall, it was just a very, very well-built mouse. With the previous Keychron M3 series mice, we have seen some QC issues on the first versions of a new batch of a new mouse, but thankfully those issues seem to have been completely resolved here on the M2. So props to Keychron, they've done a really good job with improving the overall unit QC and the packaging and shipping QC, so great job to them. Alrighty, now one other area I've been wanting Keychron to do some improvements on is in their skate department. Now previously on the M3 series mice, we've seen these very hard, very thick Teflon PTFE hybrid skates. These are totally fine for just general use and work use. However, when it came to gaming, they were very low friction, so they didn't have a lot of control on them. So one thing I wanted to see them do is move to either like pure PTFE or make the skates a little thinner to increase their surface area, just something to kind of change them a little bit. So it turns out Keychron did make some changes to the skates. However, they went too far in the other direction, and now we have these extremely thin PTFE Teflon hybrids that are definitely more on the PTFE side than the Teflon side, so they're a lot softer. However, the one on my unit was so soft it started to like insanely wear under like only like a week of use on very soft pads. Now I pretty much immediately removed my stock skates after about a week and a half of use because I saw how much they were wearing, and I just took them off and put on the X-ray pad Jade dots because they were a lot more consistent. But unfortunately, Keychron's gone from one end of the spectrum of having their skates being way too hard and way too fast, and then now their skates are too thin and they wear too fast because of too high friction. So they need to kind of middle ground this. I really do think they should just go for pure PTFE. These hybrid Teflon skates you're using are just not it, and for either a gaming or a work use case, they're just, neither of them work really well, unfortunately. So on future Keychron mice, it would be really nice to see some kind of pure PTFE skate going forward, but we'll have to wait for future versions of Keychron's mice to see if they make any additional changes to the stock skates. Alrighty, now let's talk about the main clicks on the Keychron M2. So these are using the exact same Wano blue shell pink dot switches as we've seen on pretty much all the previous Keychron mice. I really do love this switch. It feels really good, and Keychron's implementation has always been very solid. I'll give you a little click test here. Now the actual click button is ever so slightly convex, again very similar to what we saw with the previous M3 series mice. The main clicks have a little bit of pre-travel and a minor amount of post-travel. Now one thing I will note, due to the flexibility of the button itself, you can actually force them down a lot more to make it feel like they have a lot more post-travel. It will depend on how heavy you click on it. Now I haven't found that during general use I find that the pre-travel changes that much. You have to apply a significant amount of pressure for it to do so, so it's nothing that's going to affect your day-to-day use. The main clicks themselves are pretty light in terms of actuation, but they're still spammable, which is nice to see. They're not so light where you're going to accidentally click them all the time, but they're light enough where they do feel very nice and responsive and very clicky. Now, one issue I previously had with the previous Keychron M3 series is that the mice anchoring was pretty bad and the clicks would wobble quite a bit, especially if you pulled them from the top. Now, finally, Keychron has addressed this and they have completely fixed this issue, which is, I'm just so happy to see. So what they've actually done is they've added a stabilizer onto the inside inside. Very different from how they were previously stabilized. It's actually very similar to how the stabilization was done on the Razer Death Adder V3, and it is just so much better. The clicks don't wobble nearly as much anymore, which is great to see. You can't pull them away from the shell from the top anymore like you could in the previous M3 series mice. This is just a fantastic change from Keychron. I'm so happy to see this. I wish that the previous M3 Mini and M3 Mini 4K had this stabilization on the inside, because it would have made those mice so much better. I'm very happy to see that this has finally been resolved on the Keychron M2, and hopefully Keychron will have this same click stabilization and click design on their future Keychron mice, because this is probably the best their clicks have felt on any of their mice across the entire series. Now, one thing that is a common gripe that I have had with a lot of Keychron mice that is not fixed, unfortunately, here on the M2 is the indentation of the main clicks. So these clicks are still not indented in any way, shape, or form. Now, the big issue I had with these on the Keychron M3 series is that my thumb would prevent actuation for the main clicks, so I've been wanting Keychron to indent their main clicks ever since I've ran into that problem, just because it's annoying to have your main click not actuate in a game or whenever you're using it just due to your thumb holding it down. Now, that issue is quote unquote resolved here on the M2 because the sides of the mouse are so high. There's ample space for my thumb to rest on the side of the mouse without preventing actuation of the main click. Now, obviously, all of Keychron's mice are not going to have this insanely high, tall Death Adder V2-esque sides, so this issue is only quote unquote fixed on the Keychron M2 series, but in the future, it would be very helpful for Keychron to indent their main clicks going forward, specifically on their smaller mice like the Keychron M4 and the Keychron M3 minis. It would just make them overall just so much more usable, and realistically for Keychron just to perfect their main clicks, all they have to do is indent these clicks by maybe 2 millimeters and they're perfect. So we'll have to see if Keychron will do that for the future mice, specifically their upcoming GPX competitor, but we'll have to wait and see what happens. Now, one other area where Keychron has made some interesting improvements is in terms of these side buttons. Now, the side buttons themselves have not changed. They are still these chip-like designs, the same ones we've seen on all the previous Keychron M3 series mice. I'll give you a little sound test here. Now, the side button switch is still the 1.0 white dot switches, or I believe it's 1.0 white dots because I can never find out what this switch actually is, but it says 1.0 has a white dot, so I'm going to assume it's a 1.0 white dot. Now, the thing that has changed here is that the daughter board has actually changed a little bit, so the positioning of the switches have actually been changed. They're no longer laying horizontal, they're now vertically installed. Now, we do see vertical installs a lot more on ergo mice due to the taller sides. Now, the previous Keychron mice like the M3 series, it was really easy to push the side buttons into the shell quite deeply just due to how the daughter board was installed, but with the new board here on the M2, the daughter board actually helps stabilize the clicks a lot more, so you can't push them in nearly as deep as you did anymore, which is a great change. Now, one thing I did notice, because the clicks are installed on a new axis, I did notice that the actual stabilization of the side click here, particularly the first one, is a little weird, where you can kind of push into the bottom of this click and not have the click actuate, and it can kind of force the whole thing to peel out. You can do the same thing on the back side button, but it doesn't come out nearly as much as the front one does. Now, this is because the way they're installed into the side, they're just kind of installed in on this like mesh piece that looks like you're cutting a piece out of a Gundam kit. Now, it's not the strongest, which is why this wobble happens, but I will say the wobble doesn't affect the actual usability of the mouse. I haven't had it affect the actual click. I've never had the side clicks actuate because of it, but I wanted to mention it regardless just to be fully transparent. Now, in terms of the actual click feel for the side buttons, they do feel very good. They're very responsive. They have basically no pre-travel. They have some post-travel, but they have a very nice rebound to them. Very spammable. Again, they feel very similar to the clicks that were on the Keychron M3 series mice, which makes sense because they are the exact same side button. The only thing that's changed is the orientation of the switch itself. But overall, the side buttons perform very well. The only asterisk, as I mentioned before, is the slight wobble on the button towards the bottom. But again, you have to put direct pressure on it with a fingernail for it to happen. It doesn't happen during normal use, so I'm not going to knock any points for that here, because again, this is an office mouse. This is not a gaming mouse, so this kind of thing is acceptable for this use case. Now, one thing that has not changed from the previous Keychron M3 series mice is the scroll wheel and scroll wheel click. So we have the same F-switch 11mm encoder and the same 1.0 white dot switch for the scroll wheel click here. The texturing of the scroll wheel is exactly the same as we've seen on all the previous Keychron M3 mice. The scroll wheel feels good. Again, no problems with the implementation. It feels good for both work and gaming use case. I really have no problems with it. The scroll wheel click is a little heavier than I think I've seen on the previous M3 mice, but that's probably due to the shell size. But but again, it's nothing that's going to vastly impact the performance. It's a very, very, very small difference, but overall, no problems with the implementation here. The scroll wheel and the scroll wheel click feel fantastic on the M2. Alrighty, now let's talk about the sensor of the M2. So in typical fashion, what we've seen with all the previous Keychron mice, they're all using the PixArt 3395 sensor, which has all the features you'd expect to find on a 3395. And just like we've seen on all the previous Keychron mice, the sensor implementation and how it feels is absolutely flawless. I don't know how Keychron keeps doing this amazing sensor implementation, but they have just been killing it. The sensor feels fantastic, even though this is using the Telelink MCU, not the Nordic MCU, and it is only 1K polling rate. It still feels absolutely fantastic in game for general use. I haven't had a single problem with the sensor at all during my entire time of testing. So round of applause here to Keychron. Again, just another very solid sensor implementation that performs extremely well. Now, just like all the previous Keychron M3 series mice we've seen, the Keychron M2 does also have the tri-connectivity. So it does have wired use over the USB-C, it does have 2.4 gigahertz, and it also does have 5.1 gigahertz Bluetooth. As per usual with all the Keychron mice, all the connectivity modes work perfectly. All right, now one thing I did want to talk about, since we just talked about the MCU here. Now, previously on the Keychron M3 Mini 1K, which was using the exact same sensor and the Telelink MCU, which is found on the Keychron M2 here, there was an issue with the battery life where for whatever reason the battery life was just really bad. It was like 20 to 30 hours and it was advertised to be 70. So that issue has been fixed on the newer versions of the M3 Mini 1K, but since they was using the same specs here on the M2, I was a little concerned about having the same issue, but thankfully that issue has been completely resolved. So the M2 does have a 300 milliamp battery just like the rest of the Keychron mice. However, the battery life has been vastly improved. This lasts around a week to a week and a half on full charge. Now keep in mind, this is my daily work editing mouse, so I use this mouse for at least 8 to 10 hours a day, and it has still lasted an incredibly long time. So easily within or better than the advertised spec for this mouse, which is great to see. I'm very happy to see Keychron has finally managed to fix their battery, because the original M3 had really bad battery life. The M3 Mini 1K had poor battery life as well. The M3 Mini 4K had great battery life because of the Nordic MCU, and now the M2 has great battery life as well. Now they've fixed that issue. So great job there from Keychron. The battery life is superb in my opinion. Now, in traditional Keychron style, the M2 does have the onboard bottom controls. So we have a button for DPI, we have a report rate button, and we also have a toggle slider for powering the unit off, turning the unit on to 2.4 gigahertz connection, and turning on the 5.1 gigahertz connection. Now, again, I like to see these on work mice. I definitely don't like to see them on more gaming focused mice like the Keychron M3 Mini 4K, but I'd rather have them than not have them on work mice, so I'm happy to see them here. In terms of the onboard memory and the software experience, the Keychron engine has just gotten better and better with every iteration. Everything works completely fine. Saving profiles is easy, changing DPI, turning on motion sync, everything is very easily done through the software, and the software is very lightweight. This is going to be one of those situations where you have to run the software once, save the profiles onto the board, and then you're done. Now, one thing I did want to note, when you do get your M2, motion sync will be disabled, ripple will be enabled, and the main buttons will be debounced to, I believe, 2 ms. So be sure to turn on motion sync. You can turn off ripple if you don't need it, and then be sure to drop down your debounce to around 2 ms or your preferred value before you use the mouse. But overall, in terms of the onboard memory and software, no problems, no complaints at all. It's in typical Keychron style. It just executed very well. Alrighty, and one other thing that is carrying over from the previous Keychron mice is their repairability, which is a fantastic thing to see. Again, these being very budget-oriented work mice, I'm very happy to see these be easily serviceable, which is a great thing to see from Keychron, and I hope I continue to see this on their future mice. All you have to do is remove the back skate, remove 2 screws, and the unit pops open very easily. Very easy to replace the battery, the daughter board, switches, scroll wheel, whatever you need to change, it's very easy to do so. As always, I will have a full teardown of the Keychron M2 coming out shortly after this review goes live, so if you want to learn how to take this unit apart and service it yourself, replace switches, replace the battery, or anything you want on the inside, I will have a full repair guide coming out shortly thereafter, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that. Now, just before we finish, I did want to briefly mention the in-game performance. Now, the in-game performance is very good. Again, this is designed to be a work mouse, but it does still work very well as a gaming mouse, just because Keychron mice have always had great sensor implementation and great click implementation, and just like we've seen in all the previous Keychron M3 series mice, the Keychron M2 performs very well in game. If you want to use this as a gaming mouse, you absolutely could. The only downsides you'll have is the coding, and because it's a Telelink MCU, the latency may be slightly higher than you'd find on a Nordic MCU, but aside from that, it is still completely usable. I actually ended up using my M2 for gaming a fair amount by accident because I was daily driving this mouse as my work and editing mouse, and the mouse was just so comfortable, I would just use it in games anyways and still perform extremely well on it. The coding definitely was a downside because it definitely did get slippery over time, but the actual performance of the mouse itself was completely fine. I would love to see Keychron make a 4K version of the M2 because a 4K version of the M2 would probably be insanely good, but we'll have to see what they make. But if you do want to use this as a very budget-oriented gaming mouse with an ergo-symmetrical hybrid shape, you absolutely can. Just be sure to get a set of grips. My personal favorites are the Soul Spacer grips and the X-Ray Pad Cicada Wing grips, but you can pick whatever meets your personal preference the most. Alrighty, well that is pretty much everything for my review of the Keychron M2. Now before we go, I just wanted to share some quick final thoughts. Overall, I'm really impressed with this mouse. I did not expect Keychron's first try at an ergo or an ergo-ish mouse, as again is the better way of saying this, to be this good. I'm really impressed. Keychron did a really good job here. Unfortunately, this mouse does fall into some of the pitfalls we've seen on previous Keychron mice in terms of the coding not being that great and the skates being pretty poor this time. They did try to change them, but the skates are still not ideal. But overall, this is a really solid mouse, and having two sizes as well is also a huge benefit. And both of these only being $50 USD is a disgustingly good price for a mouse of this quality. So overall, I'm incredibly impressed. Seeing Keychron just grow and getting better at what they do over time just makes me more and more excited for their upcoming GPX competitor. They keep improving their mice so much every single time. I'm just super excited to see what they finally end up making. And again, it would be cool to see a 4K version of the M2 coming in the near future with a better coding and the Nordic MCU, but we'll have to see what their prioritization is for it. I don't think they're going to make one because again, this is designed to be a work mouse, but it is what it is. But anyways, that is going to be everything for today. Thank you very much for watching. I know this was a bit of a longer review, but as always, I want to make sure I go into very in-depth topics about a mouse and why it's good and why it's bad. So I appreciate you all watching and stick around for the full video. Big thank you again to Keychron for offering me a slight discount on the unit to cover the shipping costs because this review would not have been possible without them. So thank you very much again to Keychron. I really appreciate it. If you guys would like to learn more about the Keychron M2 or the M2 Mini, I will have the product pages linked down in the description for you guys. They'll be non-affiliate as usual. If you enjoyed this review, please consider leaving a like on the video or subscribing to the channel. That'd be greatly appreciated and it helps support the channel a lot. Also, if you subscribe, you won't miss the upcoming teardown video I will have of the M2 to show you guys how to take this apart and service this unit yourself. So be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that and all the other reviews I have coming up on the channel in the near future. Thank you again to everyone for watching. I greatly appreciate it, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Peace.